Hey, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tiara Pollock, and I'm the Financial Literacy Program Specialist at the Chartered Professional Accountants of British Columbia. While we're meeting today on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and in particular, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, on whose traditional and unceded territory the CPABC offices are located. Today's session is Let's Talk About Dyslexia. In this webinar, we will share information about dyslexia, dispel some common myths and misconceptions, discuss the societal cost of unsupported dyslexia, and provide suggestions about how you can make your workplace and business more accessible and welcoming to individuals with dyslexia and other forms of print disabilities. This session will run for approximately 1 hour, and we have set aside some time for some Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we will try to answer as many questions as time allots. Questions can be submitted through the chat box or by the raise hand function. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar. At the end, we will try to get through as many questions as we can. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sending out a link of the presentation and the webinar to all attendees. And we just ask that you stay on mute and keep your cameras off to save bandwidth. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator, Alicia Smith.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. We really appreciate being a part of this series with CPABC, promoting financial literacy. And I like to say that financial literacy is really built on a foundation of literacy in general, and this is how dyslexia really fits into this series. But before we jump into that, just a little bit about us. So Dyslexia Canada is a national charity, and we're dedicated to ensuring that every child in Canada with dyslexia receives a fair and equitable education. So we really appreciate this partnership and the time that you are taking today to be here to learn about dyslexia. So just to start with our agenda, as Tiara mentioned, we're going to talk about what dyslexia is. We're going to talk about the impacts of dyslexia, both on individuals and on society as a whole. And then we're going to talk about some things that you can do to help. And we're going to cover both things that you can do at home or within your family, as well as at work, within your businesses, and in the broader community. But before we get started, really, I wanted to start with a little poll to just gauge your interest, your knowledge, and your ideas about what dyslexia is so that we can use this to frame the conversation. So if you could use your phones, or you can use the URL that I think Sandra will put in the chat. You can scan this QR code to go to this website, and this will, and you'll be asked a couple of questions, and then I'll be gauging the responses, and I'll put that up on the screen in just a moment. So I'm going to leave the QR code up for just another second, and then we will go to the results of that poll. So this is, again, just a way of gauging who's here and the knowledge that's coming in, and to help me frame my discussion. I'm just going to stop the share for a second so that I can see how the results are coming in. Great. Okay. And let me just share the results. Okay, so our opening questions, well, let me get rid of this box so that we can actually see. Our opening questions were asking you to rate whether you agree or disagree. So scores in the one is disagree and 5 is strongly agree. So the first question is this idea: dyslexia is a visual issue that causes letters to move around. So we have a sort of divided response on that, average of a 3 for a response. The next question is this idea that dyslexia is rare, and it seems that most people here disagree with that, so that is very good. And then The final question is, people with dyslexia cannot learn to read. Do you agree or disagree? And it seems that everyone strongly disagrees with that, and that fills my heart with joy and delight, because absolutely individuals with dyslexia certainly can learn to read. It's about making sure that they have appropriate support, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this session. So thank you for sharing your thoughts there. Let me just get back to the presentation. Oops. Is not the right presentation. Just bear with me one moment here. Yeah, I'm sorry about this. There we go. Okay. Somehow I managed to actually close the presentation. I didn't mean to do that. Great. Okay, we're back in business. Okay, so starting off with a definition of dyslexia and really walking through what this is. So dyslexia is a neurologically based condition, meaning it's a brain-based condition that affects word level reading accuracy, reading fluency, and spelling. And I really want to focus in on the part of this definition where we say it's word level reading. And so bearing in mind that reading is actually a complicated construct, right? So really thinking about, what do we mean when we say reading? We recognize that the goal of reading is comprehension. That is, understanding a message that's being communicated through a printed means, right? So understanding what was the intention of the person who wrote that message. That is reading comprehension. But there are two distinct and important pieces that go into the ability to understand what we read. So the first is word identification. So this is kind of the mechanical part of reading. So interpreting the printed symbols and deciphering them and turning them into spoken words in the language. That's word identification, or word level reading, the mechanical part. The second piece, which is equally important, is language comprehension. So this is understanding what those words mean in that particular context, recognizing that often words can mean different things, and that there are a lot of words. So the language comprehension part is really dependent on your vocabulary, your background knowledge of the subject, and then your understanding of syntax and just the way that words and phrases are used within a language, because often things can mean something very different than what they literally sound like. So this conception of reading is referred to as the simple view of reading, and it describes reading comprehension as the product of both of these things. So the ability to recognize the words on the page and translate them into spoken language, and the ability to understand the language itself, leads to reading comprehension. And it's expressed here with multiplication to make the point that both of these pieces are equally important, and a deficit in one can lead to challenges in the overall product, which is reading comprehension. So when we think about dyslexia, as I said, dyslexia is a difficulty with the word level reading component, that mechanical part. So that's the word identification piece. So individuals with dyslexia struggle with this part of reading, even though many of us, because I am dyslexic, I didn't say that, have very strong language comprehension skills. So it's not that we can't understand the message that's being delivered. It's just that mechanical piece of translating the printed symbols into the language that we can then understand. But as you can see, a deficit in one leads to an overall challenge with reading comprehension. You can't compensate fully. And the same thing, I should say, works in the opposite direction. If a person had really good decoding abilities, they might be able to decode words in a language that they don't speak. So for example, Spanish is a very phonetically regular language. It uses the same alphabetic system that we have in English. So it's not that difficult for a person to learn how to sound out words in Spanish. And you might be able to take a Spanish passage, sound out those words, and produce some language that sounds like Spanish language. But if you don't speak Spanish and you don't have that vocabulary and you don't understand the turns of phrases, your language comprehension would be weak. And so your ability to comprehend that passage in Spanish would also be significantly limited. So it could be either piece, but individuals with dyslexia, it is a difficulty in the first aspect, word identification. Even though they can have very strong language comprehension, it can lead to this challenge with reading comprehension. And dyslexia is the most common reason. As I said, people can struggle with either aspect of reading, or they could struggle with both. But dyslexia itself, that word level reading difficulty, is the most common reason that people struggle with learning to read. And it impacts, we estimate, between 10 and 20% of the population. And I'm going to discuss why it's such a big range soon, because I recognize that's a very large range. And we estimate that that is 750,000 children in Canada, or 2 to 4 kids in every classroom. Dyslexia Canada, we are a charity, as I said at the beginning, we primarily focus on ensuring that children have access to education. So the statistics that we use typically link back to children. But this percentage of the population, 10 to 20%, holds true as well for the adult population. So you can just scale that up to the across Canada. So while dyslexia is incredibly common, it's also commonly misunderstood and it's often overlooked. So I wanted to just clear up a few common myths about dyslexia. So the first is this idea, or the first thing I should say, is that dyslexia is not caused by low intelligence. So just to flip this on its head, very often people imagine that all smart little kids learn to read very easily, right? But we know that there are a lot of very intelligent people who have struggled with learning to read due to dyslexia. So often you'll see lists of famous and successful people on the internet. Dyslexia Canada just put out our Breaking the Silence Market Read podcast for this year, where we interviewed 10 incredibly successful, intelligent Canadian individuals who struggled with learning to read due to dyslexia. So there is no link between that struggle with learning to read and a person's overall intelligence. You can be a very, very smart person and still struggle to read because of that. The other thing I want to point out is that dyslexia is not caused by a lack of motivation. So again, often when kids are struggling, parents or teachers might say, oh, well, if they just tried a little harder, or, oh, maybe we just need to find the right book, something that will interest them, that will spark their motivation, and they'll just pick that book up and they'll just magically start reading it. And certainly, hard work is great, and giving kids lots of, interesting books to read is wonderful. But if the child is struggling due to dyslexia, they are not going to be able to motivate or will themselves into reading. They need something more. So that is not the cause. And finally, dyslexia is not caused by poor parenting. And again, this is often phrased in the positive, this idea that if kids are read to when they're babies and they're in literacy-rich environments, that they will just pick up books and they'll start to read them. Or sometimes in the negative, sometimes when we look at overall provincial reading results and we see that 42% of kids in British Columbia did not pass the last reading assessment, it often gets turned around on parents. Oh, if parents just read more to their kids, it would be fine. And again, reading to kids it's a great thing to do. It's really important. It really helps with building that second part of the reading that I talked about, language comprehension. So we really want to encourage parents to read to their children, but no amount of reading to your child is going to prevent the word reading difficulties that are associated with dyslexia. It just doesn't work that way. And it doesn't help to blame parents. That also can sometimes prevent parents from seeking help for their kids, which is unfortunate because of that stigma. So the next thing I wanted to just address is this idea that dyslexia is a visual issue. So I see this crowd was quite divided on that, half and half, really, in terms of whether we thought this was true or not. But it's a really, really common misconception that dyslexia is primarily a visual issue where people see letters backwards or see things moving around the page. And that has really led to a rise in treatments for dyslexia that are based on treating it as a visual issue. So things like vision tracking therapy. Actually, my next slide, lots of things. Special fonts, colored overlays, special glasses, things of this nature. None of these treatments for dyslexia are evidence-based. If dyslexia could be solved, if individuals with dyslexia could read, if we just used a different font, that would be wonderful and amazing, and we would have no need for Dyslexia Canada to be a charity. Unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than that, and these solutions are not supported by evidence, and we do not recommend them. While none of these things seem like they would be harmful to children or to anyone, it's the focusing on these instead of effective treatments means that there's a period of time where effective treatment isn't happening. So it's an opportunity cost, and it can also be a financial cost because a lot of these things are actually very expensive. So we really do caution against that. So dyslexia is often hereditary. We know that it runs in families, and that if an individual has a parent or a sibling who was either diagnosed with dyslexia or struggled to learn to read words, whether they were diagnosed or not, because there's a lot of people who are not diagnosed, but if there's a family history of word level reading difficulties, then a child is at a significantly increased risk of having dyslexia. But there's lots of science and research that's been happening over the last 50 years looking at these issues, looking to see, is there a dyslexia gene, that just says yes or no, you have dyslexia. And what we know at this point is that it's a lot more complex than that. There's not one single gene. It's a constellation of genes that sometimes interact together, as well as protective factors that can be in place for the child. So the protective factors piece is really exciting and really encouraging, because it means that even kids who are born with a strong risk of dyslexia, if we can make sure that all those protective factors are in place, we can actually ensure that we can prevent them from having the extreme reading difficulties that are often associated with dyslexia. So I'm just going to go a little bit into that area. But before I do that, I would love to pause and just ask Sandra and Tiara if there were any questions in the chat to start with, or if anybody has any questions now before I launch into my next piece. This would be a great pausing point. I'll just take a look at the chat.
Yeah, there's just the one question, Alicia, about the slides. Are we going to share?
Absolutely. I'd love for you to have my slides. Thank you. Great, I'll carry on. Okay, so as I said, scientists have been doing a lot of research on dyslexia over many decades, and they've actually learned quite a lot, and it's a very encouraging and exciting time. So I mentioned that dyslexia, it's not related to intelligence, it's not a visual issue, but we know that it is running in families, it's hereditary, so kind of like what is it and what's going on? So my next couple of slides just kind of unpacked that. So one of the biggest takeaways from all of this research that's been going on, looking at how people learn to read and why some people struggle due to dyslexia, one of the biggest discoveries is that learning to read is not a natural process. So human beings, our brains have evolved over like many, many, many hundreds of millennia to communicate using spoken language. And because of that, our brains are kind of wired to do this. So children are born with brains that have networks that are all kind of ready to go to just suck up spoken language and learn to speak and learn to talk. But we are not born with the connections in our brain that allow us to read written language, because written language is a relatively new phenomenon. So it's only been around for like a blink of an eye in terms of evolutionary time. Our brains did not evolve to read. This is something that we actually have to repurpose parts of our brain to be able to do, right? So this little brain diagram here shows that the spoken language and the meaning of context, these parts are tightly interwoven in children before they learn to read. But the visual processing part of the brain is further back, and there isn't a connection here when we're born. This is something that is built over time. So it's repurposing this part of the brain to build these connections between the visual processing part of the brain and the part that processes spoken language that allows a person to read. And it's really interesting because scientists have been able to look at the brains of children during various points of reading development, and they can see this network develop over time as they are learning to read. And in children with dyslexia, it's the repurposing of this network that is more challenging. It's not that it can't be done, but it is more challenging for them to, just because of the way that their brain is wired, to create these connections initially. But again, they have learned a lot about how these connections are formed and what we can do to help children and adults to create these connections. So, what we've learned about how reading develops and how these connections are made is that there is a process that we go through to create these connections that are very robust connections in the brain that allow us to instantly and automatically recognize words. So I've just put a word up here in blue, the blue box, the word cat, which I would imagine that most of the people on this call today looked at that and you didn't need to consciously really think about it. That word cat probably just leaped off of the screen and you just recognized that it's the word cat, and you probably couldn't even stop yourself from reading it if you wanted to. So it's that instant and automatic word recognition that is really necessary to support reading comprehension. And this is what individuals with dyslexia struggle to develop. But the reason that you can do that you can read that word cat instantly and automatically, is because at some point in your past, probably when you were a child, you actually sounded that word out. So you took the time to look at the individual letters and think about what sounds those letters represent, and then you were able to take those three sounds and blend them together into the word cat, which is a word that you have in your vocabulary. So it's this act of connecting letters to the sounds, to the meaning of the word, that starts to build those connections. Additionally, those connections are reinforced if ever you spelled the word cat. So if you wanted to write a little story about your pet cat Fluffy, and when you were 6 and you had to think about that word cat, and you thought, oh, well, there's 3 sounds, cat, and then you mapped those sounds onto the letters that spell them, that helped to reinforce and deepen and build that connection, right? So it's the act of decoding words to read them and encoding, like breaking words apart to spell them, that form that network in the brain. And it's the practice of doing this with lots and lots of words over time that builds up a really robust reading network in the brains of adults that are reading well. But as I said, individuals with dyslexia, they have difficulty with building this network. And there's a couple of reasons for that I'm going to get into in a moment. But I think it's important to just pause and recognize that, everyone's brain goes through this same process in learning to read. So there's another common misconception that children with dyslexia need something completely different. That's not true. Science has now figured out that basically everyone's brain goes through this process, and we have to do the same things to build the reading network. It's just that for some people, that reading network is built very easily. And for other people, it depends on their access to instruction and the amount of time and repetition that's needed to build those connections. So about 30% of people do learn to read pretty easily. They don't need a lot of explicit instruction, but about 70% of people do need some support with learning the skills that will allow them to sound out words, to read them, and break words apart to spell them, right? So research has shown that the most efficient way to teach all children to read is through systematic and explicit phonics instruction. That is the most effective way to teach children to read. And this is one of many reports that summarizes the research around reading and teaching children to read. This one came from 2003. The challenge is that this has not been popular in education, and phonics instruction was removed from most school curricula in the 90s. So it's not what is happening for most kids in the general classroom. So this is causing a real problem for a lot of kids. So, as I said, about 30 maybe 40% of kids do learn to read pretty easily with broad instruction. For the kids in the middle, maybe a little bit of that instruction and how letters and sounds relate and how to put them together is all they need. Maybe they can get that at home. Maybe they are getting that in school, even though it's not in the curriculum. But the amount of instruction, the amount of how explicit that instruction needs to be, and how much support and how much practice kids need to develop those skills really exists on a continuum. And kids with dyslexia are on this end, the tail end of this continuum. So they can build those connections, but they do need a lot of support and a lot of really high quality instruction delivered over an extended period of time to be able to do it. So there's a couple of things in that model of reading that individuals with dyslexia typically struggle with. And the first one is the ability to identify and work with the individual sounds in words. So while a lot of people think that dyslexia is a visual challenge, dyslexia is more often a challenge with hearing the individual sounds in words correctly and working with those sounds to put them together. That's a key component of that model of reading and how the connections are formed in the brain. The other challenge that individuals with dyslexia often have is difficulty mapping the letters to sounds. So English is a very complex language. We have 26 letters, but we have 44 sounds, and we have over 200 different very common ways to spell those sounds. That's a lot. There's a lot for somebody to pull together. But that can be taught systematically and explicitly in a nice gradual way so that kids can master all of those letter sound correspondences so that they can start to build those connections. Because you need to be doing that. You need to be mapping the letters to the sounds to the meaning to build those connections. But because those two things are difficult, individuals with dyslexia often have difficulty, as I said, hearing and manipulating the sounds, and also have difficulty remembering the letter sound like correspondences. Often we develop coping strategies. So many kids with dyslexia or adults with dyslexia will guess at words, or they will memorize words. So, and this has been encouraged through the school system as well. This idea of using other sources of information to identify words is actively encouraged, as is memorizing whole words. If you cite words on flashcards, that sort of thing. And people can memorize some whole words by sight. However, not enough to become a skilled and fluent reader. So what we know is that skilled fluent readers can instantly recognize over 30,000 words, I've heard 30 to 60, depending on, your education and how much reading you do. But there is simply no way that the human brain can actually memorize as a whole unit 30,000 words. It just doesn't work. So for kids who are using these coping strategies, they can look like they're doing okay with reading in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, but they usually hit a wall by the time they're partway through grade 2 into grade 3, because at that point, they need to have strong enough decoding skills that they can independently read words and continue and decode them themselves, and then continue to build that bank of words to get to that 30,000. And you can't put that many words on flashcards. The other issue is that a lot of kids with dyslexia, if you're really struggling with those things and reading was really hard for you, you're going to avoid doing it. So you're not getting as many miles on the page, and you're not mapping as many words as you need to. So you're not building those connections. So what we know is that problems with reading that happen early on, if there isn't intervention that's happening, typically are the problem only gets larger over time. So this is the idea that the gap when kids are in kindergarten is fairly small when kids are just learning letter sounds. But if they don't master those things, they'll end up on the wrong trajectory, and that gap between the weaker and the stronger readers only grows over time. So that's why it's really important that we get kids help when they're young. But the good news is that decoding skills are actually highly responsive to intervention, especially when we get in there early, when that gap is small, and we get kids off on the right path starting in kindergarten. And I do have a little study to share that was from British Columbia. So I thought this would be interesting for this audience. And so this is really talking about the power of early intervention to prevent dyslexia and reading difficulties. And as I said, there are protective factors. There are also risk factors. So this was in North Vancouver, and this was done in the late 90s. And this was all of the schools in the North Vancouver School Board. They screened all of the children on entry to kindergarten, and they found out that 23.8% of the kids were at risk for word reading difficulties or dyslexia. So as I said, that's a little higher. I said, 10 to 20%. So they found 23.8% were at risk. This is not a diagnosis of dyslexia. But then depending on what happens for these kids, as they go through school, some of them will get to the point where they could be diagnosed with dyslexia, and others will have those protective factors put in place. They'll get support, they'll get intervention, and then they might not meet the criteria of dyslexia. What is the definition? So the interesting thing about this study is they found 23.8% of kids were at risk, but they taught all of the kids, starting in kindergarten, systematic and explicit instruction in phonics and phonemic awareness. So that's the decoding skills, how to work with the sounds and the letters and sounds and letters to read words. And then they provided additional targeted instruction, an extra dose of that same instruction to the 23.8% that were considered at risk of reading difficulties. And they continued to screen the kids and provide that intervention as kids needed it until they were at the end of grade 2. And by the end of grade 2, they only had 4.2% of kids left that had reading difficulties that would be at the level where we could consider doing a full assessment and diagnosis of dyslexia. So this is really, really a powerful example of how reading difficulties can be prevented if our education system is functioning well and meeting the needs of kids. This is only one study. There was a similar study done in Edmonton about 10 years ago. They managed to reduce reading difficulties to less than 3%. And there have been many other studies, enough that we can say pretty confidently that word reading difficulties that are associated with dyslexia can be prevented over 95% of the time. But unfortunately, we're not doing that in Canada at this point. We really have not embraced the science of reading or evidence-based instruction in classrooms. And as a result, we have perpetually had over a third of kids leaving high school without reaching the level of literacy that the OECD and Statistics Canada says is necessary to fully participate in the modern economy. The number for BC right now is actually worse. It's 40 something percent. I should check, but the most recent piece of data. But nationally, we say conservatively estimating a third of kids. So I like to flip that around and say that any failure above 5% is a failure of our education system to adequately support our children and our teachers. Because this is not because teachers don't want to be teaching kids to read, it's because we are not giving them the tools and the training that they need to do it. And that's really important because the impacts of dyslexia are far-reaching, both on the impact that it has on the child, the whole family, and on society as a whole. So starting with just the impact it has on kids. So your first job when you're a child, when you go to school, is to learn to read, right? No kid goes in there saying, oh, I don't want to learn to read. Not at all. They all go in there shiny-faced, expecting that they're going to do this. And when they struggle and they look around and they see that others are learning to read and they're not, they start to believe that there is something wrong with them, that they're stupid. And it really has a terrible impact on their self-esteem and confidence. So I have a quote from a child that I'm going to show that sometimes people find troubling. So if you find this troubling, just fair warning, don't read it. And I'll put it up on the screen here. You can just take a moment to read it yourself in case this isn't something that you want to see, because it does, yeah. It can be difficult for people to read. So clearly the impact on the child at the time is devastating, right? It can absolutely kill their self-esteem and their confidence. And it makes them less able to participate in school as a whole. If you're struggling with reading, you often have difficulties learning across all areas of the curriculum. So what starts off in kindergarten as a difficulty with just sounding out words can spiral into, being behind in math because you can't read the problems, being behind in social studies and science because you can't access the information that you need to learn, right? So that can lead over time to significantly reduced educational and life opportunities. We know that children with dyslexia and children with low literacy in general are far more likely to drop out of high school, and they are far less likely to be able to succeed or to participate fully in post-secondary education, which reduces their ability to find jobs and the options of the jobs that they could have, which of course reduces their lifetime earnings. And it also puts them at an increased risk of experiencing unemployment, poverty, and homelessness. And it also increases their risk of involvement in the criminal justice system. There was a study by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police that found that 65% of incarcerated individuals in Canada have low literacy, below a grade 8 level of literacy. And interestingly, they also found that not only does having low literacy or unaddressed literacy needs make you more likely to perpetuate a crime, but also more likely to be the victim of a crime. So they found victims of crime were far more likely to have low literacy skills than anyone else in the population. It also has a huge impact on mental health. So it's estimated that 40% of people with learning disabilities struggle with anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. And they're 46% more likely to have attempted suicide. So the impacts on the individual are enormous and they're lifelong. And I'm sure that you can extrapolate from some of the things that I mentioned that there are also far-reaching impacts on all of us in society. So there's obviously the cost of, the social programs that need to be available to wrap around people that have not had the access to the instruction that they need. There's also the economic impact. So this was a study where they looked at the literacy demand. So that's the bars in red, according to industries in Canada. These are the literacy profiles of people that they need. This rating scale 1 to 5 is the scale that the OECD uses to measure literacy skills. So 5 being the highest level of literacy, we would associate with somebody who has completed university. Level 4 is more of a college level, and level 3 is what Statistics Canada says is the minimum standard necessary to fully participate in the modern economy. So you can see that in red, that is the demand of Canadian employers and Canadian businesses. But these bars in gray, this is the actual literacy profile of Canadians as determined by Statistics Canada. So you can see that there is a big mismatch between what employers say that they need so that they can be competitive and what we have right now. And that has a lasting impact on the overall economy as well. There was a study by Deloitte that looked at the cost of low literacy and the potential benefits to Canada investing in literacy for people. And they determined that a 1% rise in adult literacy would be associated with a 2.5% increase in labor productivity and a 1.5% rise in GDP per capita, which at the time was $32 billion of economic growth annually. That's 1%. And currently, as I said, conservatively estimating, we have a third of young adults that are leaving high school without low literacy. And we have the potential to have at least 95% of them getting there. So there's a lot of potential for growth here and a lot of opportunity cost that we are missing out on. And this is why Dyslexia Canada really believes that access to effective reading instruction is a human rights issue. And so we worked at Dyslexia Canada with parents, with our local Decoding Dyslexia group, which is a parent organization, with the International Dyslexia Association Ontario, and we brought these issues forward to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And we said, hey, look, science says that the most effective way to teach children to read is to provide them with systematic explicit instruction in phonics. But Ontario removed that from the curriculum, and as a result, we have all of these children that are not learning to read, and their parents are having to pay for tutoring. They're having to go to extreme lengths to get them this instruction outside of the education system. But every child has a right to an education, and if you're not teaching them to read, you're not fulfilling your legal obligation as a province to provide kids with that education. And interestingly, the Human Rights Commission agreed with us, and they launched a full public inquiry, which took 2.5 years to complete, but they found that Ontario was systematically failing students with reading disabilities and many others. Because this issue, as I said, it extends beyond dyslexia. It's about a third of kids that are not learning to read. Dyslexia is the most common reason, but there are other reasons as well. But all of the kids would benefit from systematic and explicit instruction. So the Human Rights Commission in Ontario made some sweeping recommendations for changes, and lots of good things are happening nationally, in Ontario and nationally. So since that happened 2.5 years ago, we have completely changed the curriculum in Ontario to bring in phonics instruction. We have implemented universal early screening, which for the first time ever is happening right now. Every child in Ontario from kindergarten to grade 2 is going to be screened with an evidence-based tool to determine their risk for dyslexia. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of making sure that those children who are at risk receive the intervention that they need, so that that screening data can, so that we can prevent their reading difficulties. But there is a lot happening that is positive, but it's very inconsistent across Canada. And in British Columbia, you still have not updated your curriculum to ensure that children are receiving effective instruction at school. So that's a big problem. So getting to the how you can help part. So I know I've thrown a lot of information. I see that there are some questions in the chat, so I want to get through this so there's time to answer those. And I really have sort of 3 areas where you can help. So starting with kids. So if you're a parent, a grandparent, aunt, uncle, if there are children in your life, I would encourage you to really learn about the warning signs of dyslexia. Because as I said, the earlier that we catch this, the better it is that for the kid. We can help them and we can prevent their struggles down the road. So a couple of early warning signs: difficulty learning the alphabet or sounds. Trouble sounding out words. So if you have little words like cat and the child is really struggling to put that together, that's concerning. If they're guessing at words when they read or switching words in a sentence. If they really don't like reading. So if the child is really avoiding reading, it might be because they're struggling with these things and you just don't know. So we have on the Dyslexia Canada website, we have a full list of signs and symptoms at different ages. We also offer print materials. We send these out to schools and libraries, and you can order these off of the Dyslexia Canada website. So if you're looking to help raise awareness in your community, you can contact us through the website. We can send you out these little checklists and these little brochures, and you can distribute those in your community so that people are aware of the need for early identification and support for kids. If you're a parent, ask about the reading instruction your child is receiving at school. This is true across Canada, but especially in provinces like British Columbia, where your curriculum still includes outdated, disproven methods, which are actually that can make learning to read more difficult than it needs to be for children with dyslexia. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would recommend this podcast series that sort of talks about the history of reading instruction and why it is that we're not using what science says is the most effective way to teach kids to read. And contact us, because we do have a list of questions that parents can ask at school about what is happening for your kid. The next thing I'd say is if you're at all concerned about your child's reading development, seek help right away. Don't wait and see. And again, if you have questions or concerns, you can reach out to Dyslexia Canada. So we have a volunteer network that answers questions. You can just email us at info@dyslexiacanada.org, and we will help you determine what are the appropriate next steps for your child. But it's also important to think about and provide emotional support. So as I said, learning to read or struggling with learning to read can take an enormous toll on a child's mental health. So helping them to understand what dyslexia is, if you have a child that, has been struggling and has been diagnosed, is really important. We've created this little book for children that walks them through. We can also point you in the direction of resources for adults that explains what dyslexia is for adults that might be affected. I can say as an adult, learning more about dyslexia has definitely helped me to be more confident and more comfortable talking about the challenges that I experience. For your kids as well, I always recommend trying to identify their strengths and build on those. Everybody needs an area in their life where they feel like they are very successful. That helps to create the reserves of stamina that kids with dyslexia need to have so that they can go through that process of learning to read. Because it takes a lot more time and effort sustained over a long period of time to build those connections and get there. And I also suggest providing positive role models. And so this is something we've been working on at Dyslexia Canada. We've just put out this podcast series, Breaking the Silence, where we are profiling successful Canadian individuals who have dyslexia. They're talking about their journey, their struggles, and really helping kids to understand that, you can get there. And I would encourage anyone as well who's listening today who is dyslexic. We have an option, or we are asking people to share their stories with us all the time. So again, you can get in touch with us and we'll send you to the place where you can share your story. Additionally, accommodations are really important. So while kids with dyslexia can absolutely learn to read, it still is something that requires a lot more effort and a lot more time for them to do. So there's a lot of different accommodations, like the ability to have text-to-speech or speech-to-text, extra time to complete assignments, or breaking down instructions. So to help with this, Dyslexia Canada has created these little accommodation cards that have these stickers on them. So you can work with your child, you can sit down and you can go through these stickers and help explain to them what the accommodations are that they are allowed to have. And then they can give this card to the teachers or supply teachers, whoever's there, to help communicate their needs and advocate for themselves. So for supporting adults at work, the first thing that I always like to say is that people need to recognize and understand that dyslexia is a disability, and individuals with dyslexia have protection under the Human Rights Code, both at work and in the community. But also recognize that everyone with dyslexia is different. So we're not all the same and we don't all have the same needs, right? So ask them what they need to be successful at work. But bear in mind that a lot of people are hesitant to talk about the fact that they have dyslexia. They don't want to verbalize it. They don't want to talk about it. So if you notice that somebody in your workplace or is having difficulty with tasks that require a lot of reading and writing, you don't need to ask them if they have dyslexia, but you can certainly ask if there are things that you can provide that can help them to be successful. So some common things are a quiet workspace. So for individuals, even for adults with dyslexia, as I said, reading sometimes takes more effort and more concentration. So distractions can be particularly challenging. So having a quiet workspace, access to specific technology or software. Personally, for me, I can't live without Grammarly at this point. It is amazing for me. I do use text to speech. If I have a lot of documents that I need to get through, I will listen to them. And that helps me get through things more quickly. So just making sure that people have access to those things and that documents are provided in a format that will work with screen readers or with that technology. Not all PDFs do. Providing reports and written documents in advance is really important. And any training materials or things that you're trying to communicate across your organization, providing those in an audio-visual format or as accessible PDFs that can be listened to is really important. But also be aware of situations that can provoke anxiety or embarrassment. So I really would encourage you to avoid ever putting anyone on the spot, whether you know they have dyslexia or not, by asking them to read out loud. That is something that can really provoke, deep anxiety in those of us that have struggled with reading. Also, not asking people directly to write notes in front of other people, ask for volunteers if that's possible. And then another thing that's a big challenge is filling out forms. So if you have forms that need to be completed and they need to be completed by hand, well, first of all, try to make sure your forms can be completed on a computer. But if there are things that need to be completed by hand, a nice thing that you can do so that you're not putting somebody on the spot is to yourself or someone in your organization sit with the person and just read the questions, ask the answers, and record them for them. And then, you can obviously give them the option to fill it out themselves if they want to. But if you just do that as the first choice, that can avoid a lot of embarrassment for people. And also make sure that the responses that you're getting are accurate, right? I know that myself on health forms, I sometimes don't fill out the whole thing. I'll just be like, no, I'm fine. Just moving on, I'm fine. Just because it takes too long for me to figure out how to spell those words. So I would also encourage in the workplace and in the community to really spark conversations, talk about dyslexia, celebrate the neurodiverse and dyslexic individuals in your organization, and provide opportunities for them to connect with one another. And a great way you can do that is by celebrating Dyslexia Awareness Month, which is happening right now. And that is October is Dyslexia Awareness Month. And our theme this year, as I said, is breaking the silence. And we are really encouraging individuals to speak up and to share what they have struggled with, but to also celebrate the successes and the contributions that they have made. And I realize that I have almost at time, so I'm going to stop there and take the questions from the chat.
So Alicia, do you want me to just read you some of the questions?
Sure.
Okay, so there was one early one just asking about pens like C pens. Are they useful or not useful?
So a C pen is, just for people who don't know, it looks like a marker or a highlighter, and it scans the text, and then you wear headphones and it reads the text to you. So it's a device that it has a purpose. Like often they are used when kids are taking exams and you don't want to give them access to the full internet or a computer. I find them a little bit clunky myself, but I would encourage people to try them out and see if it's the right solution for you. I do know some people that do find them useful. Some public libraries are stocking them, and you can just borrow one from a public library and try it out for 2 weeks and see if it is a good solution for you. Because it's kind of expensive. Like a C-Pen is, I'm not sure how much they are now, but it's kind of an expensive investment. And I would really encourage, if possible at all, to try one out before buying it to make sure it's the right solution.
Okay, so the next question that came up was if a child has dyslexia and is learning in a second language, can this delay their English language growth?
So that's a really interesting question. And lots of, I'm assuming it's probably a French immersion piece because we're in Canada. But with appropriate support, kids with dyslexia can be successful in French immersion. My own son, who was the person whose note that was from the beginning, was in French immersion. And what we found was that he did well learning French orally. He was fine with that. He was picking up the vocabulary. He was talking to people, but he was having difficulty reading in both French and English. We were not able to get him any support in school in learning to read and write in French. So we focused exclusively on English. We were able to get him some support, mostly at home, but some at school, in learning to read in English. And once he started to learn to read in English, his French writing came along as well. But the same process of learning to read happens regardless of what language you're trying to learn to read in. So with French, it's the same thing. They need to be being taught how to map the sounds to the letters to decode the words. So I would really ask a lot of questions of the teachers in the program. Are they using a phonetic approach to teaching the kids to read in French? Because that will transfer to the reading in English. And if you're only able to provide support with the child of learning to read in English, that will help to transfer to them learning to read in French. So it's reciprocal. I would say it really depends on the kid, whether that's going to be the right choice of programming or not. But if with the right support, kids absolutely can be successful.
Okay. Next question was, so we talk about early intervention. When should that start? What's the recommended age?
Kindergarten. So this is why we're really focused on trying to get early screening happening in kindergarten. That's the point when kids are first starting, that's when the gap is the smallest, and that intervention can start right then. It doesn't need to be a big, long intervention when kids are in kindergarten. Often it can be just a 15, 20 minutes a day kind of piece at that time. As kids get older and as time goes on, the intervention needs to be more intense for it to work. So the earlier, the better.
Okay. Okay, so there were actually a few different questions about supporting adults with dyslexia, and I know you went through some of those things. Are there actual resources that people can go to that you can think of off the top of your head to sort of help people?
Sure. So it depends on what kind of support the adults are looking for, right? So while we focus on preventing reading difficulties and early intervention, it's really important to know that reading ability can be strengthened at any age, right? So there's no cutoff point. So if the adult is looking for support with improving their reading abilities and their writing abilities, there are a lot of things that can be done. So a dyslexia tutor could certainly help. There are some community-based organizations, depending on where you are, that might have programming that can help. I found, because my reading abilities have massively improved as an adult, through the process of helping my child learn to read, right? So I had to learn about all of the letter sound combinations in English and how phonics works and all that stuff as an adult so that I could help my son. And going through that information myself, I found all free resources online that kind of explained how all that worked. And then through going through it with him, that really helped me. The other thing that really helped me was reading out loud to my kid. So one of the most evidence-based strategies for improving reading ability is actually oral reading out, like reading the same thing over and over again out loud. Which is something that, most adults don't read out loud that much. But if you have little children in your life, they always love to be read to. So that process of reading Curious George 17,000 times a day really did help me that way. If you're looking for help at work in terms of getting accommodations in place and that sort of thing, there are different resources that I can suggest for that. Because as I said, like dyslexia is a disability, so you have the right to accommodation at work. So if that's the nature of the help that you're looking for, I would say reach out to us at Dyslexia Canada, and we can try to put you in touch with legal resources in your province.
Okay. So being tested for dyslexia is really expensive. Are there grants or other financial supports that families can take advantage of other than, like, I guess, just the disability tax credit?
Yes, so that's a tricky one. Testing for dyslexia is really expensive. And this is one of the reasons that Dyslexia Canada is advocating so strongly for early screening. Because there is an alternate route to diagnosing dyslexia. It doesn't need to be the $4,000 psychoeducational assessment. It can also be done through building a profile of the child over time. So screening a couple of times a year, starting in kindergarten, and then documenting how the child is responding to intervention that's provided in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. Building that profile over time, a psychologist could then look at that and use that to diagnose dyslexia without, $5,000 or $4,000 worth of concentrated testing happening on one day. It's actually a much more reliable profile, and it's more useful information as well. Unfortunately, the education system in British Columbia certainly isn't there yet. So in terms of getting more affordable testing, technically speaking, school boards should be providing you with that testing. You shouldn't need to pay for a test to get support for your kids. That's a legal right that's been established. So if you are trying to get that official diagnosis so that you can get support for your child at school, reach out and we can help you navigate that. If you're trying to get the official diagnosis because you just want to know, that's different. Sometimes universities offer testing through the university where you can have a graduate student do it at a reduced cost. So that is another route. But again, reach out to us at info@dyslexiacanada.com and let us know where you are, and we can work with you to try and get something sorted out.
Okay, one question. When you have a child that's newly diagnosed, how do you tell them? I know we've both been through this. What's the right way to tell them?
Yeah, so I mean, again, it's going to depend on your child. There are some really nice resources that you can use. We have the book that I showed the slide of before, so you can contact us, and Sandra will email you, or she will mail you.
Mail it.
You'll
Yep.
mail you a copy of that book. It's free. And that's a little book that is specifically designed to talk to children about dyslexia. There are also some nice little videos online that talk about it. But I think directly addressing it with the child is the best way to go. Personally, I kind of went on a dyslexia propaganda campaign where I just constantly bombarded with my child with profiles and stories of really amazing, successful people with dyslexia so that he could see that, this was just, we've just now figured out what it is, and that's fantastic. And now we know what to do, and we are going to get you there and look at all of these really cool people with dyslexia. So that is one of the reasons that we've started working on that with Dyslexia Canada, creating those profiles. And then the other piece is really encouraging any adults in that child's life who also have had struggles and who also have dyslexia to share those openly. So I didn't really talk openly about my dyslexia before I had a child with dyslexia, but that really spurred me on to talk openly about it. And that's really helped. I think it's helped him. It's helped to make us closer. And other people in our family have also shared with him his experience. Do you want to chime in, Sandra? I know you've been through this too.
Yeah, for me, it was really, for me, the conversation started before the testing because my son's self-esteem was so low that I said, we're getting this testing done so we can figure out why you're having trouble reading. And so I think you could still do that after the fact and say, the whole reason why we did this is because we saw that you were having trouble. And, here's why. This is why. It's not because you're dumb, and so we had that conversation a lot at the beginning. And now, yeah, same thing. I kind of bombarded him with a lot of facts about dyslexia and until he sort of got it into his head that, okay, this is not something that's his fault. It's just something it's just part of him. So now he embraces it.
Yes, yeah, my
Yeah,
son too. Yeah, I
yeah,
very much framed it as this is good news. This is great news. We know what's going on and now we know what to do. So this is amazing.
yeah,
I do see, Sandra, that there's somebody in the chat that said they had a hard time with the diagnosis because the psychologist called it a learning disability and refused
yes,
to say the word dyslexia. That is really common.
very.
So there's, and I had a slide for this, but I pulled it out because of time. But um, learning disability is a broader category and it is defined in laws in a lot of places. So a lot of the legal supports that we have come from the learning disability legal framework, right? But when you look at the diagnostic and statistic manual that psychologists use to diagnose dyslexia, it says that there are 3 subtypes of learning disabilities: reading, writing, and math. And it does specifically say in the DSM that dyslexia is an alternate term for that learning disability if the issue is word level reading, right? So whether your psychologist will write it on there or not, I have that little piece of the DSM screenshotted that I can share with you, and you can just attach that to whatever email accompanies your, psych ed assessment when you're sharing it with the school, and say, here's what it says, but it's the same thing. It is dyslexia, and we prefer to call it dyslexia. That was one of the things that was identified in the Ontario Human Rights Commission inquiry, was this idea that people were not allowed to use the terms that they prefer, right? And they very much said, that it's up to the individual. If you want to call it dyslexia, you can call it dyslexia and you're well within your rights, and that the education system needs to respect that in the same way that would respect any other way that people choose to identify themselves, right? So that's how I would handle that. But if you need that snippet, just email and we will give that to you.
Yeah. Just a couple more. So should we have a high school student tested, so that they can get accommodations in post-secondary?
Yes. So I guess 2 things here. So if this is a student who's never been assessed before and they're in high school and they're having difficulties, I would say yes, absolutely. You need to get an assessment. try to work with the school to get the assessment done. Like there's a lot of assessment that should and could be done through the education system. If the child already has had a diagnosis of dyslexia at some point, they shouldn't need to get another one to go to university. Though we do know that a lot of universities will tell you that you need to have another one done. But we've had a lot of success through our parent support line of reaching out to university accessibility offices and talking to them about that. So if that is something that you're experiencing, again, reach out to us at info@dyslexiacanada.org. We have a couple of people who are really happy to pick up the phone and call that university office and say, hey, this is ridiculous. Dyslexia is a lifelong thing. This kid was diagnosed. They should not have to pay another $4,000 for an assessment to get accommodations through your institution. And every time so far it's worked. So I think we've been pretty good on that track record.
Yeah, definitely.
You can push back. One of the things though, when your kid does go to university, they don't want to deal with the parent anymore. So really the child has got to be the one that's advocating for themselves. So it can be difficult, but they do seem to be fine with us calling them up and just making blanket statements that they should be providing accommodations for everyone. So we can do that for you.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, one last one that I pulled out, specific to the BC curriculum, since it's out of date and not evidence-based, like what kind of support should parents be asking for? Like this person who asked the question was asking if they should have an EA with them at school.
So what I would say is, yeah, the BC curriculum is out of date. It needs to be updated dramatically. But there's a lot of growing awareness and enthusiasm amongst educators in BC. And there are some school districts in BC that have been really looking at this stuff and making a lot of changes. So I would start by asking questions. Like I wouldn't assume that they're getting good instruction, but I would also not assume that it's terrible. So we do have a list of questions I can provide and I can suggest that you bring in. And that list of questions has sort of, here's what a good answer might be, and here's what a concerning answer might be. And then depending on the answers that you get, like that's where you need to go from there to determine what the needs are for your specific child. And it's going to depend on their age and the severity of the dyslexia and what that instruction looks like in the classroom for them. So that's a really tough one to answer without first asking those questions at school.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate what you've already said is, with specific questions like that, reach out to our Dyslexia Compass team. There is a form you can fill out on the website or just email us at info@dyslexiacanada.org.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I see somebody asked if we could email out the list of questions, and we certainly can do that.
Yeah.
Those questions will be contained in our new parent guide, which is going to be coming out soon. We're just sort of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, but it has a really robust section in there about reading instruction and intervention and the questions to ask at school for both of those things. But I can send you some early advanced excerpts of that, and we'll send you the questions that went into that.